Hey guys, how's it going? It's been a couple days since I watched it, and still I'm like, oof, gotta settle into this one. But we're back. We're here. This is Cookie Pocket, as you know, since you clicked on this. And we are discussing Gallipoli, a Peter Weir film, who, as I said in our intro, is, or rather the preview in our last episode, he's probably best known for films like Witness and Dead Poets Society and The Truman Show. But Peter Weir is a pretty important figure in Australian cinema. And Gallipoli is, I think nowadays, somewhat unknown, except for those particularly interested in Weir as a director and Australian cinema as a genre. But it was made in 1981, and it stars rather young Mel Gibson and Mark Lee as two young men who enlist to fight in World War I. And it's pretty intense, and where you end up is, well, let's just say big spoiler warning on this one. Though, interestingly, I knew it was going to happen this time, and it hit me a lot harder than when I didn't know it was going to happen. We'll dig into that. What were your general thoughts on this, guys?
I am always intrigued by Peter Weir films because he's not a director that I'm necessarily a huge fan of, but I'm very curious about his work, and I particularly like his earlier, more Australian stuff when he was kind of part of the Australian New Wave, and eventually he did end up being brought to the US to work in Hollywood. I think his first Hollywood movie was Witness, and then after that he made The Mosquito Coast and he made The Truman Show, and I don't think his inherent Australian identity is really as much a part of those. But in movies like Picnic at Hanging Rock and The Cars That Ate Paris and The Last Wave, those are very much about Australia. And I think this is about Australia kind of in the same way. I didn't, like I mentioned at the end of the last episode, I kind of expected this to be like a really big war epic. And I think it is a war epic, but it's a war epic where you spend most of the time not really in the war at all. In that regard, it kind of reminded me of the approach to war that something like The Deer Hunter takes, where the war is as much about what these men left behind as where they ended up. And I do like how it addresses kind of the perspective of these soldiers, where for them, a lot of the war is sitting around on a beach or in a trench, waiting for things to happen, and then going over the side, charging towards the other line for maybe at 5 seconds and getting shot, and then the war's over for them. And I do think that's kind of an interesting perspective, because I think it's fairly rare that you see that kind of monotony of war presented in a war film, at least like this. I was pretty stunned by the cinematography. But I like how, despite this movie being so big in its scope, it still feels small in its style and the way that it's produced. It's a very intimate movie, and the beauty of its landscapes and its shots is very attainable. It's really just down to everything that works here. It's just down to the application of natural lighting and a good eye from the cinematographer, which I think it's always enormously encouraging to see a movie that looks really good, but the reason it looks good is because they're just using what anybody has access to. So I gave this a 4, and I think the ending, which we will definitely discuss, it's pretty shocking, and it's, I think, pretty bold in how abrupt and sudden it is, and there's really no epilogue at all. And I also thought they really kind of intelligently pulled a fast one on the viewer, at least nowadays, because now I think the poster that most people will recognize for this film features, spoilers, the very last shot of the movie. That's the image that they're selling this movie with now. And I think when that moment arrives, you kind of realize just as it hits you, oh, this is the end. Like, this isn't going anywhere. And that is really shocking.
Yeah. And also it looks a lot like he's like finishing a race, like running through the line in a race. So That's pretty cool. That's pretty neat. I think we all became a little Aussie after this one. Mel Gibson really makes you feel patriotic for every country he's in every war, except America and We Were Soldiers, but every other, well, maybe a little bit, but anyway, yeah, it was super impactful. I was really surprised in a lot of the same ways that you both were with. Just how little actual war was happening on screen, and it was very bold to kind of associate the characters more with what they were leaving behind, like Zach said, and more about like what their youth was all about and the things that they cared about and how simple their lives were leading up to that point. And they're all like chipper and happy all the time and doing stupid hooligan Aussie things, those miscreants, and just kind of having a good time while they're just kind of getting into this thing they don't really know anything about. And I think really what makes it most effective, more even slightly more effective than the remake of All Quiet, is that not only does All Quiet focus mainly on the actual battle scenes, but it also lends to their individual personalities and makes you understand very quickly like that they were human beings that had like different relationships and different things that they prioritized, that had very clearly different opinions about things, and they kind of represented like the average diverse youth of the average Commonwealth nation at the time. So having them being suddenly thrust into this war, and they all kind of just agree like, oh yeah, we have to obviously fight for this nation, and like even if they were apprehensive about it, like Frank was, it didn't really take much for him to be in the same boat and like, wanting to be a horse rider and everything. And it was just kind of it was very surprising that there wasn't very much war in it, but to be honest, like it was very necessary, and there was still a lot of battle scenes regardless. And I think it was just because the battle scenes were filmed for just about as long as they would have actually taken place in real life. Even though the whole campaign's like 8 months long in real life, and there's like it's a constant meat grinder like the whole time. It reminds me of 1918 a lot. Obviously, like calling off the battle and everything. There's definitely some inspiration from Sam Mendes, taking inspiration there, and I think that was just it was so I already knew they were gonna die. Like by the time they were dancing in the ballroom, I knew they were gonna get murked, and I just didn't know how or when, and it's very obvious why this was such a big deal to Australians and New Zealanders, because it's even though they're losing, and even though there's some sense of ignorance, and that this was kind of just like a terrible thing that was forced upon them just because they were part of a greater Commonwealth, it didn't really feel like that. They didn't really feel like victims. They kind of just felt like they were taking pride in whatever they were doing, even if it was the most like minuscule thing ever in the greater sense of the war, and also like one of the most like poorly planned operations in the entire war and like in British history ever. And I think that is what makes it a very like nationalist, patriotic kind of movie. And that's something that's very unique, especially being an anti-war film.
I think it's interesting that the horse riding doesn't really amount to anything in the end, because there's that whole element of one of our leads is a member of the cavalry, and he can ride horses, and Mel Gibson's character can't. So they end up in these two different not departments, that wouldn't be the word, but in these two different groups, units, they're separated. He's part of the infantry and he's part of the cavalry. But when he eventually does die going into battle, there's not a horse to be seen. He's sent over the top with all the other foot runners.
Yeah, that is interesting, seeing that sort of, and I think that was handled well when Gibson sort of breaks the news of his transfer to his other buddies, and then there's this like fractious moment where his friends think that he views himself as somehow better or more important than them because of that. Yeah, this movie really knocked me out. I watched it for the first time about 2 years ago because in one of the supplements on the Criterion release of Wall-E, Andrew Stanton, the director, cited it as a big visual influence to him, which is interesting. It's not something that really, even after this rewatch, seems like an obvious influence to Wall-E necessarily, though I think both are beautiful films in their own way. The ending really knocked me out. It's the only time I've ever rewatched something and it's made me cry when it didn't make me cry the first time. But I think maybe part of that was I did watch this with my dad, and maybe just like this weird thinking about the state of the world and this fractious energy. And I tried to get at this in my review, and I don't know if I did. I'm maybe being a little too didactic, but I think why it hit me so hard is it sort of quickly but deftly explores the sort of arbitrary nature of the conflict in World War I through these complicated systems that we all learn about in high school. And Franz Ferdinand is essentially the butt of a joke, but this movie really reminds you that like a lot of people died because of that, and it's not really clear to them or their families or their countries why they should have. But on the other end, I think there's this contradictory but equally well-presented sense of a civic duty of it, and not necessarily pro-war, because I think this film is very much an anti-war film, but we see Frank, Mel Gibson's character, as pretty resistant to the idea of enlisting at the beginning of the film, in part because of his family history with the British Empire. But I still think there's this undercurrent of at least an idea of service to something bigger than yourself. And I think it's very difficult to juggle that with this heavy anti-war message. So this actually graduated up to a 5 for me. It was initially a 4.5, but maybe a couple little things we can nitpick here, including the score. But I was just really knocked out by this movie.
Tying into that idea of service to something greater than yourself, I think it's one of the important aspects of this being an Australian film, because I didn't know this until I was reading up on this movie, but also two of Australia's like defining values that apparently are like listed in their like governmental documents are Larkinism and mateism, which are in the reverse order. The bond between the brotherly bond between friends and messing about with your mates. And I do think that we see that throughout the entirety of the movie leading up to the battle. And so I think the loyalty and the bravery that Gibson's character demonstrates is really drawn from just that bond that he has to his friends and to the people that he knows, and to the things that they did when they were back home, and the hell that they raised when they were younger. And that's something to be loyal to and reverent of as much as a nation or a flag that you march under.
Yeah, and I think this kind of leads me into one of my criticisms, actually. One of my very minor criticisms is that they try to juxtapose that with like the general like British manner of things, and just like the way like the British military is. And they always do this all the time. Everything does this. Even Band of Brothers does this, okay? It's like, oh, I can't see the tank. I can't bloody well shoot at it. and then like, you are the most ill-mannered, miscreant Australians I've ever seen in my life. You're not real British people. And it's just like the most frustrating thing. And having the commander have like an upper class Australian accent, which I read into was a major criticism of the film, that sounded very much like a British one, also didn't help. And having the, as I found out, because it didn't sound right, I looked it up, the historical inaccuracy of the British landing and them not having any any resistance when the British were landing, having tea on the beach.
Yes,
And I was like, that was way too. First of all, I know for a fact that could have not possibly happened. So it was actually ended up being New Zealanders in that specific instance. Like in the grand scheme of the operation, there were a lot of British landings afterwards, but the one they were referencing was actually New Zealanders that actually did have a little bit of resistance when they landed. So I thought that was interesting. I don't think they need to push the national identity thing and have it juxtaposed with the nation that they're under to necessarily have it be more effective, because I think it's effective on its own. I think you're already basically an Australian by the time they actually get to Gallipoli. Like you're like ready to freaking fight with them by that point. And I think that is like the only thing that was definitely recurring that was a little bit annoying.
Yeah. I guess that's kind of tying into the more contemporary feelings of when the film was released and kind of pushing this idea of an independent Australia. Australia is not, we are not an extension of Britain. We're not just where the Brits sent all of their prisoners and all their unwanted trash. We are our own nation, and we are proud of ourselves. And whether or not we were sent up the river by Britain in this fictional or some other factual context, we can still be proud of what we've done, regardless of, maybe that isn't historically accurate in the specific case here, but I think that's definitely the message they're trying to push alongside kind of the story of the war.
Yeah. It's interesting hearing that historical background. I still think like this general like rumbling about the Brits is probably appropriate, even if it's not matching what happened. I'm a little bit more willing to excuse it also because there's this obvious like intelligence failure in the midst of the battle that causes this big tragedy at the end. And talking about this whole national identity angle, and it's obvious this is like a very Australian film, and like Zach said, Peter Weir's heritage is like worn on his sleeve with his heart. But I think the scenes in Cairo are kind of fascinating in terms of how he kind of portrays these things in a less flattering light. The most obvious example to me being that scene with the shopkeeper, where one, I guess the two guys buy the same like kind of phony souvenir that's supposed to be a relic, but is fake because it's identical, and they both bought it at a store. And Gibson and his buddies rumble into the store and demand their money back. And at first the guy's like, that's not mine. And then they kind of rough up the store and knock down some shelves. And then he gives them the money and is like, go, please go. And they scare him into submission. And then on their way out, the guy turns around and he's like, wait, guys, that was the wrong store. And it's such a fleeting moment, but really captures, I think, in an admirable way for a movie that's so earnedly nationalistic and appropriately critical of the British Empire and these other things. It still portrays that there's this like edge to nationalism and just like this brash self-righteousness that shouldn't be worn on the sleeve as much. But there's sort of sections of the film. I want to ask you guys more broadly about the Cairo section. What did you make of that locale and the setting?
I was really astonished by some of because they shot that all on location with the actual pyramids. And I was astonished by some of the stuff they were able to shoot. I know that, well, if I'm honest, I don't necessarily know what the political and national state was of Egypt when this movie was filmed, but I know that like tourism and their kind of international relationship with other countries has really increased since this movie was released. I mean, especially with the advent of the internet, and anybody can get a ticket to go to Cairo now on vacation. I've been to Cairo, but like at the time that they made this, I'm assuming that like the guidelines on like their historical attractions and things weren't as firm, which meant that they were able to get away with a lot of shots and filming in a lot of locations on this that I have to imagine they wouldn't be allowed within like 500 yards of with camera nowadays. Which I guess ties into other aspects of, there's some things that I questioned whether it was a criticism of the characters or simply our kind of the viewer's relationship to Cairo and these relics of the pyramids being different now than it was when the movie came out. There's a moment where the characters climb the pyramids and they chisel their names next to Napoleon's on the pyramids with the year that they were there as well. The question, I guess, is that meant to be a sweet moment for our characters where we see kind of their brotherhood and how their union in that moment is going to last historically? There'll be some sign of it. Or is that a moment where we see that they are kind of an invading or corrupting force to some extent despite their union, just as Napoleon was an invading force to Egypt? And I mean, maybe it's both, maybe it's one or the other. I'm not sure. I think that's one of those things where the way that we look at that kind of thing as viewers has changed a lot since the movie came out. So now that has more dimensions than it might have at the time.
I think the guiding force behind having that scene, I would imagine, was what would these goober kids do, like, to kill time while they're waiting for deployment? Like, what would they do? What would be, like, really silly? And I feel like if you think about, like, the first 20 things that they would do that would be really stupid and be like something really childish that you would do in this foreign location that most of them have literally zero knowledge about, is like, that would be one of the things. And like, you'd get to the point where you'd start to have imagery that definitely kind of touches on the things that you mentioned, Zach. And I think that kind of literal, just like filming just whatever happened as whatever they were doing at the time, has so much value in and of itself, just because there's so much irony and a lot of metaphors that are kind of inherent in them, like leaving Australia and going to Turkey to fight in this war. Is like, there's so much that's like that can be analyzed out of it, that it's like just simply showing them doing really dumb stuff like in front of the freaking pyramids, and having like some people like Archie like knowing about the history of politics, and then the history leading up to that point, and Frank not giving a crap about it at all, that kind of thing. Like, just, it's just a huge diverse set of characters doing a diverse set of things that you could totally imagine they would just be doing at the time, like just being average kids, average Australian kids at that.
Yeah.
One of Frank's friends, there's the scene where they're playing rugby in the shadow of the pyramids, and he seems a little more aware and respectful of the pyramids and the Sphinx and kind of the history of where they are. Where does that go? Does that go somewhere? Does that kind of have an ending point, his kind of awareness of that? Because I remember that shot of him looking at the Sphinx, but I don't know if I remember much beyond that.
Yeah, I don't know. I remember him sort of lecturing about the like historical importance of it and how much effort went into building them, and the pharaohs being like buried within them or whatever.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think that might just be another notch in this sort of tricky question that might have both of the answers you posed earlier, Zach. I think another example of maybe a less comfortable scene to talk about, but there's the moment when Frank and the buddies are sort of looking at these nude photos of women, and Frank grumbles to himself how women have no self-respect these days. And then like 2 scenes later, most of them go off with prostitutes, while the one guy is like, this isn't right, and sits down. And which, by the way, he's kind of like the mealy-mouthed one. I'm relieved that Mitchell did not put Christian Maric as that guy in the rundown. But another
I'll get
scene,
you next time.
Another scene that I think invokes these kind of complicated moral questions, both in terms of national identity and judging others and not holding yourself to the same standard. I also think the structure of the film, I mean, we've talked probably more about Mel Gibson's Frank to this point, but Mark Lee's Archie is as important, if not more important, I would say, to the film. And I think structurally it's interesting because it feels like for the first half hour or so, it's pretty much all Archie. And even when he meets Frank and they become friends, and there's this sort of middle quarter or third of the film where they get to know each other and try to enlist. It feels like for the first half of the film, very much Archie's film, and then they get separated and we stick with Frank, not Archie, which I think is an interesting choice. And then eventually they reunite, but even after they reunite, it feels like the film kind of sticks with Frank's perspective, which is interesting. Do you guys agree with my sort of analysis of the protagonistic preference that Weir has, and what did you make of this sort of co-lead dynamic?
It definitely does switch over. I'm trying to think of where they come from that maybe makes it more interesting to stick with Frank. Or, I mean, I guess there is the issue of Frank initially doesn't want to be part of the military. He kind of takes some convincing, and when he does eventually decide to sign up, he does it under the claim that, oh, well, I'm not doing this to fight for the Empire. I'm doing this to get in and make my way up to an officer and, have the good life for myself. I'm doing this for me. So I guess with that as his mission, maybe there's more for him to be disillusioned about. But it is interesting that we mainly stick with him. And it might also just be that as a member of the infantry, he is probably going to go through more of the dirt and maybe see some tougher, less glamorous stuff than Archie would. But yeah, it is an interesting question of what is Archie up to during that time that Gibson is training in Cairo before they meet up again, and dodging venereal disease and all the stuff that they get up to in Cairo.
Yeah, I think him having the biggest like turnaround, I guess, in his philosophy, and we kind of already know what kind of person Archie is and who he would kind of be under fire, I guess. And having the infantry perspective not only prepares you for the later infantry scenes, but also having kind of focusing on the character that was more apprehensive about it, and him being like very clearly like the most committed soldier, or being portrayed as like the most committed soldier by doing that massive run, and not making it is kind of a pretty, I think having that bit of background leading into him being deployed and everything is kind of pretty important. I really don't think I missed out on anything not focusing on Archie, because Archie just bro runs fast. That's like his biggest personality trait, and he's kind of smart, and he knows more about like what situation they're in. So all he really had left to as a bookend was to die, and that's like the most depressing part of the film for him.
I guess Archie is kind of more in touch with the natural environment of Australia, and Australia as a land versus Frank. So maybe that's just the goal of starting with him, is that we get more in touch with the land that they're leaving behind, and kind of the beauty of Australia, which is always a focus of Peter Weir during this period of his career, by starting with him on his uncle's ranch, and by starting with that race across the outback on foot and on horse. We get more acquainted with all that these characters are leaving behind than maybe we would be with Frank, who I think the first time he walks into the picture, we're already in a more populated, at least town area. So maybe there's less of kind of Australia's natural beauty to get to know if we had started with Frank.
And as far as I know,
interesting distinction.
I don't think I'm pretty sure Gallipoli was a set. I don't think it was on location. I don't remember. I thought I read something about that.
I read about this as well. There's a section of beach in Australia that they cordoned off and built up to resemble Gallipoli, and apparently it was renamed Gallipoli Beach. And there's like a monument to the Australians who died in Gallipoli that was like built on the beach.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That is pretty cool. Hearing you talk about like what Australia means to each of those characters is very interesting, Zach. And it actually makes me think of American politics. Without naming names, I know that right now
Joel
each
Biden.
political party. I know, but this is actually not, for once, not critical of either party.
Sure.
Interestingly, one side, at least recently, is more keen on vocalizing America as an idea or an aspiration, while I think the other side in its messaging is more keen on referencing it as a homeland to be protected. Two, I think, equally valid ideas, but it's just interesting to see how those characteristics can be at odds with each other. Fascinating stuff. I want to talk a little bit more in detail about the ending. Of course, there's this big emotional gut punch of Archie running and being shot, but there's quite a bit of a build up to it, and initially Archie is going to be designated as the runner because he's obviously super fast, but he says he wants to fight, and he basically says Frank is just as fast as me, so Frank ends up being the runner when the communications fail because they have to run as opposed to sending things through the line. Do you guys think the ending was well handled, and other characters factor into this as well other than Frank and Archie? So I think a lot of times a great film can be made by its ending. So what did you make of this ending?
Yeah, I think it's a good one, and just as much for Archie as it is for Frank. I think that in some ways you could maybe call it even more of a tragic ending for Frank, because Frank kind of develops and grows this sense of patriotism, or at least this sense of allegiance throughout the movie. And the end of the movie is him kind of failing to live up to that. Not necessarily through his own fault, but he has this mission. He has to send this message to protect his friends and save everybody on the line, and he's not fast enough. He doesn't make it. So there is, I think, more of a personal tragedy there, maybe, for that character, in him realizing this goal he can work for, only for it to come crashing down when he most needs to live up to it. And I think a lot of other characters make that ending as well. I think the captain or their superior officer, who is kind of weighing the decision of, do I disobey this order? I know that if I keep sending these men over the top, they're just going to be killed immediately. But it's my job to do that and to follow the orders of my superiors. And his kind of weighing, how should I approach this? I think that's really interesting. And that did also remind me of, there was a very significant Australian new wave film that came out a few years before this called Breaker Morant. I forget when that's set, but that's like a military court-martial movie. And the whole issue of that movie is there's an officer who has some soldiers executed because he was ordered to, and then there's some stipulation over whether or not those orders were accurate, and he's put on trial. But this idea of like obeying orders from the top down does seem to be something that was pretty significant to Australian war cinema at the time, or a significant talking point.
Yeah, I especially like how bro had one job and messed up. He was like, oh, the one thing I had to do right. I like how this has been portrayed in other war films before too, because it's always so freaking convenient that people die in like the worst moments. I mean, either the best or the worst moments possible. But like in actual war, like it's usually somebody's mistake or your own mistake, or it's just like really bad timing. Like you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's like 99% of the time how you die in a war, is because somebody made a stupid mistake, you made a stupid mistake, or it's just like you're in the worst place at the worst time. And I really enjoy that type of storytelling, especially as a bookend, because it makes everything leading up to that point all more effective. You seriously feel like you lost like 80% of the movie, like everything that happened is completely pointless. Whereas if it was just like a war and you're like, oh, you just met this Jewish guy from Brooklyn, and you said something bad about the Bible, and then they fight, and then 5 minutes later he gets shot, and you're supposed to feel bad for him, and you're like, but I just met him like 5 minutes ago, But for this, it's like, oh, we met all these people super early on, like they're best bros, hanging out, doing Australian mite things, and then they just get friggin' shot, and that's it. And it's just, you can see the line of mistakes leading up to that point. Like, you can see how and why they died, but you still don't understand. Like, you come out of it wondering, like, why did it have to be them? Which is like, it's like a family type feeling. Like, you just heard that your son died in the war kind of feeling. Like, that's how Christian was probably feeling. He was like, bro, okay, I knew he was going to die.
Yeah.
He said he was going to go to the war. It's so sad. And he's supposed to run as fast as a leopard. No. He ran so fast. No.
Yeah.
God bless Australia. Yeah. What was the question, Christian? I totally forgot. I got to.
I think you answered it. It was just a broad question
good.
about the ending and how it worked for you. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great. I was going to mention also that most Australia, this is also very much like how you'd feel about Americans and the Revolutionary War too. Most Australians are somehow English. Like, either they're from England or they're not too many generations behind from England, or they're actually genetically from England. And I thought that, not to mention that their accents aren't terribly far off from being British either. And we've kind of seen this like in other, like Braveheart, for example. I could bring up Braveheart, right? And it's just like they're so close to being British, but they're not British at all. And the whole film leading up to that point really emphasizes the fact of like what it really means to be Australian. Like you kind of talked about, Zach, with those two tenets they have, which just makes them getting shot at the end all the more sad.
Yeah.
I thought the focus on the machine guns throughout because we don't really see a ton of like, oh, we're on the battlefield fighting. We see men go over the top. We see machine guns fired, and we see people falling, which I think is interesting that we don't really see much of the conflict throughout most of this film. The first time that kind of the infantry really go off into battle, we hear it for a moment, and then we cut to the aftermath where they're saying, oh, so-and-so died, so-and-so's not going to make it. But the focus they put on the machine guns in this just reminded me of, and it might not even be a deliberate message in the movie, but kind of the futility of kind of this constant development of weapons that happens during the early 20th century. And it reminded me of the guy who invented the Gatling gun, either John or Richard Gatling. I can't remember his first name, but he said that he thought it would bring an end to war because with a weapon that destructive, no one would possibly want to go to war with each other ever again. And not that long afterward, you see similar weapons being used to mow down people en masse on battlefields throughout World War I. And it kind of shows how there's no weapon powerful enough to be the stopgap. All right, we're done. I'm a reasonable man. We shouldn't do this anymore. And I thought that was interesting. The movie at least evoked that thought.
Yeah, definitely. I remember don't remember a ton of history in high school, but one of the strongest things I remember about World War I is how brutal it was in terms of casualties, because that's when machine guns were introduced, but there was still this old style of trench warfare that just resulted in massive casualties. And that's certainly a huge part of the ending here.
What the heck, guys? Taking over my freaking knowledge. Oh, I know about guns and history now. What is your freaking problem?
I have to get something on you. Come on.
Well, okay, fine. I'll bring up another fact.
Oh.
It's interesting to think about that literally the day before Anzac Day, which is when the Gallipoli campaign started for the Anzacs. The Armenian genocide started when the Turkish started expelling a whole bunch of ethnic minority Armenians out of Constantinople. And all this, the Armenian genocide evoked nationalism in the same way that the Ottomans winning this battle evoked nationalism, which ultimately gave rise to Turkey, which is the Republic of Turkey basically emerged out of World War I for that reason, because there was a lack of British influence and because they had a lot of national pride, and they also didn't want to be like a fully Muslim state anymore either, because waging jihad didn't really work anymore. It worked against the Armenians, huh? But anyway, yeah. So that's an interesting fact.
Wow.
Yeah, and also
And
the
with
Maxim
that,
gun.
Mitchell's back on
Zach.
top.
Damn straight. And the Maxim gun was the first real fully automatic gun. The Gatling gun shot 10 rounds semi-automatic in sequential order, but the Maxim gun is what eventually evolved to the MG08, which is what the Germans used in World War One and gave to the Turkish.
Well, okay.
Interesting. Yeah. I think the other part of the ending that really guts me is the thing with the commanding officer, when he says that he won't order his men to do something he won't do himself. Maybe that seems like sort of a cheesy line, but it really, really got to me. In part because we get this brief introduction with him when the men are first shipping out, and all of the young men around him are celebrating riotously and sort of embracing the moment as a celebration, and it's only him and his wife that realize the gravity of the situation, and it's kind of a very morose goodbye between them. I think it's a great example of the sort of brief but effective characterization that's kind of all over this movie. Like in the beginning, we haven't talked a ton about the beginning, but a lot of it's about Archie's racing ability. He's got, I guess, a generational talent in terms of short races. And his uncle coaches him, and there's this sort of recurring thing. What are your legs? Steel springs. How fast can you run? As fast as a leopard. And it's a little old-fashioned, but it really kind of sticks with you as a viewer. And the actor that plays his uncle has this very kind of gruff, memorable persona about him. And I think Mitchell kind of made a joke about this earlier, about describing Archie. I think if you were asked to describe any of the characters in this film, you might not be able to muster that many things other than athletic, Australian, patriotic, not very
Hookers.
Patriotic. Kind of looks like David Bowie in certain light.
Yeah. Young Mel Gibson looks like a Paul Mescal, perhaps. But I still, like, despite that, you get a really strong sense of everyone's humanity. And I think that's a real accomplishment. Most films don't have time to tell you every character's life story, and in reality, if you're to step back and forensically analyze every main character ever, you'll realize that there's a pretty commonly repeated pattern there. But here you just get a really strong sense of heart, I think. Yeah, that's about all I had. I don't know if you guys have any closing thoughts.
I did want to mention that I liked, the movie isn't really as much about this, but I did like the inclusion of the Aboriginal character who is at the beginning of the film and works on the ranch with Archie. I think his name is Zach. But he's played by an actor who appears in The Last Wave and maybe a few other Peter Weir films, because that's also definitely a part of the Australian New Wave as well, is this idea of Australia as a land for the Aboriginal people versus the Australians who were kind of forced there as prisoners at some point in the nation's history, and that complex demographic. And the movie doesn't really get into that, but I appreciate at least the head nod to that, which is tackled more head on in other movies that Peter Weir and other directors made during this period.
I wonder if they had any New Zealand characters, because the accent sounds so freaking similar that I can't tell.
Yeah, I couldn't tell.
I don't want to be racist towards them, because I know that that's a big deal for them. Call a Kiwi and an Aussie, you're going to jail.
Yeah.
And it is interesting how different those cultures are, despite how close the two nations are to each other. Yeah,
it's like it's almost like they're embracing like every stereotype possible, except they didn't mention kangaroos or koalas. But
they did not.
Everything, but like them being like brat. It's just the way I think about it is that we've been so overwhelmed with like, oh, like these were just like miscreant British people that were the patriots that like took over. You should watch the Patriot movie, Mel Gibson. And you're just like, this is like what America is really all about and everything. And it's not really 100% true. And like the way we kind of idolize the Revolutionary War is a whole lot different. because this nationalism literally came out of like direct victimization and like being forced into this war. Like that would be such an easy route to take as an anti-war film. But because it focuses on the individual human characters and their backgrounds and how simple and easy it was to just kind of like, oh, I just want to get out of my house. We gotta go. We get them. Get the enemies. Germans are winning. We can't let this happen. And then they go and freaking fight them. And they're not even fighting the Germans. Another irony. But yeah, I just think it's a very, very unique, a very perfectly chosen battle. It's a very like once in a lifetime kind of way you can portray an anti-war film. And yeah, it's definitely one of the most unique anti-war films I can think of. Just solely based off of that. It's just because every it's like ingrained in that battle is a lot of things that would normally be tropes in other movies or like ways that would be much easier to get out of. But there's a lot of creative thinking and passion that went into this production, and it definitely comes across.
Yeah. I think one potential point of criticism is the score here. Some of it was done.
Oh yeah, I can't believe it.
Yeah, pretty strong synths here from the Brian May stuff. Brian May of Queen. And on my first viewing, it definitely bugged me a little bit more. Brian May's also done kind of similar sounds for the first two Mad Max films. Interestingly enough, it didn't bother me as much here. Maybe just because I was used to it and expecting it, but I do think it's used to sort of evoke the coming of age sport film moments more of when Archie and Frank are still kind of buddying up and when the races break out. Those moments, when the music starts, it's very obvious and you're like, oh my gosh, this feels like a different movie, but it only happens 3 or 4 times. And then there's kind of a more traditional orchestral score for the closing credits and some other more obviously dramatic moments. So, yeah, mixed on it. Okay, week in review.
Yeah, I guess I can talk about on Week in Review a movie I mentioned last time but didn't talk about, or I guess the time before last, because last time would have been Lennon Naked. And that is Longlegs, because for maybe the first time in my entire life, I saw a movie twice in the cinema.
Wow.
Because I saw Longlegs last week, and then I had some friends who wanted to go yesterday when we're recording this. And so I thought, you know what, I want to go along. I want to see how they react to it. And I also wanted to see how I felt about it now that I kind of knew what it was, because the film was pushed very well, but in a very particular way by the marketing. The Neon did a fantastic job of marketing this as the movie so frightening, you'll die. And on my first viewing, I didn't find it to be that, and I was a little disappointed by it not being what it was marketed to be and not being what I hoped it would be. But on a second viewing, I was really satisfied by what it was and what it was going for. And I think a lot has been made of Nicolas Cage's part in the film. I don't want to give away too much, because that is definitely one of the things that the marketing has kind of held back for good reason. But I will say, the first time I went into it, I was expecting Longlegs, which is his titular character, to be a little less present, and I kind of felt from the way that it was advertised that kind of the malevolence of his actions and the idea that he could be anywhere were what would make him frightening and a threat, and that maybe we wouldn't even see all that much of Nicolas Cage in the movie. And I thought that would be kind of a really daring performance or turn from an actor who is usually at the front and center of your attention as a viewer. And his performance in this isn't quite that. It is a decidedly Nicolas Cage performance. But on this second viewing, I did find myself appreciating that a bit more for what it is. And additionally, there's lots of great details built into the movie that give you hints of what this character might have once been. because he's kind of an enigma, but the movie is very much kind of a portrait of him in the production design, in the music, in the needle drops, in kind of the costuming and little things that are only in the frame for like a second. You really get kind of an image of where this character came from and how he ended up in this place, which I really did appreciate. It is very frightening, even if you're not gonna suffer cardiac arrest in the cinema, but it is still very frightening. Seeing it even the second time, coming home at night to my big empty house with a basement that I only occasionally hear creaks in when the house settles, I was very disturbed. And I think if you like horror, this is a really good time, and you should try to see it in the cinema, or at least watch it with some friends. I will almost certainly buy this, because I think even though I've seen it twice, it's a movie I will continue to get more out of seeing it more and more times over the years. So 4 out of 5 for Longlegs. Very, very good, even if it's not quite what it was built up to be. And I really do recommend it.
Wow. I'm genuinely scared now to see it, Zach. I don't know if I can handle this.
Ooh.
This is very high praise coming from you, and I'm actually encouraged by the fact that you're saying it's both very, very good and not what it was billed or necessarily expected to be.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting.
Who next?
Well, don't look at me. Gosh.
Okay, fine.
Do I really
Fine,
have to
Mitchell.
talk about this? No.
Uh-oh.
No.
Love Island
I'll
season
go.
2.
Huh?
No, even worse. It's even worse. The Boys season 4.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no.
Thank you for the lead-in, Zach. I appreciate it. Well, Homelander done killed me wife and took me bloody son. And then the Starlight's jawline. Can't get over it.
Ah.
Well, Erin Moriarty. She does have one good episode in this whole season, I think, that she acts very well.
Mm-hmm.
She has to portray 2 different types of characters, is what I'll say. I won't spoil it. But I'll just say that I kind of anticipated the ending. It reminds me of a very big film franchise that did the exact same thing very recently, and it's definitely, it gives you a sense that things are not going in the boys' favor, and that Homelander's winning is kind of the sense you get out of it, as portrayed by a lot of the marketing material, where he's just kind of standing outside of all these different Capitol buildings across the world. Yeah, I'll just say that, like, they pretty much, the actors even admitted this, that season 4 was going to set up season 5, right? And this is confirmed. Season 4, 1,000,000% sets up season 5. The end of season 4 definitely is like, we know what you want to see. We're just going to show it all in season 5. Very frustrating. I would say that there are enough elements in the show where if you latch on to certain types of characters that have their own acting style and have their own like personality in the show, and you want to see more of that, then I would say the characters are developed enough where you could latch onto that reasonably. It's not like this is a complete throwaway show where all the writing's really bad and the actors are like paper thin, or the characters are paper thin. I mean, I don't think so. I definitely think that there's distinguishable characters, there's real conflicts. The problem is that you don't really feel a threat from the Supes anymore. Like, the novelty that Homelander won't just go and just like murk everybody in the boys immediately is kind of really wearing down. It pretty much wears down all the way by the end of season 1, right? And that's what's really frustrating, because you're like, why don't they just go and just kill them? Like, they know exactly where they are, right? And they even poke fun at this in this season too. Like, they have in this season as well. They're kind of just poking fun at the irony that the boys are mostly human, and that the Supes can't just go kill them because there's like this political like advantage to them being alive or something, and a lot of these throwaway excuses. It was, I have to mention this just because of the insane timing of it, but the boys kind of plays, you know what I'm about to talk about.
Yeah.
The Boys prides itself on being satirical of political events. So while there's major political events such as assassination attempts happening, like 2 days before the last episode is talking about an assassination.
Yeah, this happened about a week ago when we're recording this, audience. This will come out later, but
yes. So that definitely was. Sadly, some pretty good marketing. Probably they even had to change the episode name. It was like Assassination something. They changed it to season 4 finale, which is pretty insane. So this kind of goes into my point that the political satire thing gets worn and tired. When they're basically saying "Make America Great Again" in the show, it's like, all right, we are really hitting the nail on the head at this point, like over and over again. Like, I understand who everyone's supposed to be. Like, oh, the January 6th thing, like, it's just like, look, the real life is already enough satire for one day. Like, having it portrayed again in this type of show where like sex and violence is like the whole point of the graphic novel, like being shock value is like the main point of the graphic novel. And they put that into the show. It turns into a big mess. It's a big mess, and I know I could probably on my fingers right now could tell you the number of plot points that are going to come true in season 5 because it's that predictable. So I just have to mention The Boys again, just because it's such a massive show right now, and there's so many memes about it, and it's literally like Amazon Prime's like biggest thing that's attracting them to the Prime Video service right now. So yeah, I don't know if I'd recommend it. Season one. I'll recommend season 1. How about that?
Yeah, since you talked about it earlier this season, Mitchell, I did catch up and I finished the season with everybody else. And
oh, nice.
My biggest issue with season 4, I think, is that it did feel like a real big pause, and kind of the main threat of the season is, or the main conflict of the season is, we have to get this person into presidential office. We have to make sure they get into presidential office because they're going to enact laws against the soups. But Homelander is so unhinged at this point that even if the season ended with those laws being enacted, you know that he would just fly into the White House and kill the president. Like, it just feels like a huge, like, stumbling block to, we need to do this so that season 5 has this and this and this as stakes. And it just kind of feels like a big, all right, say it with me before we move on to the ending. And additionally, I feel like the show isn't really about anybody anymore. Like, the first season and the second season were very much about Huey, this normal guy, being introduced to this world of fighting with superheroes. And now that he's been doing that for a while, he kind of isn't really a normal guy anymore. And it kind of feels like nobody is the main character. So who are we meant to care about or relate to? That was like a real difficulty for me throughout the season.
I would think it would be Butcher, especially because he has like his wife and his old compatriot, who, by the way, Jeffrey Dean Morgan, I knew they were just putting him in here just because of the Walking Dead thing. And he's 100% typecast. Okay, you cannot argue that Jeffrey Dean Morgan is Negan. There's no other argument for that. But I'll say that Butcher is probably supposed to be sort of the main character, but they don't give him enough screen time and focus on him enough. And he only has one real thing he cares about, is Ryan. So it's just like, you're not really given anything to care. I care more about the Deep's relationship with his octopus than I care about Butcher getting his son, because he's been talking about it. I know.
I cared
it's
most
what's her
about...
name that voices it too. What's her name? Shoot. She's bald. Who am I thinking of?
Oh, Ashley.
No, not Ashley. Oh, yes, but I'm talking about the one who voices the octopus. What's her name?
She's bald.
Oh, I feel so stupid. Oh, I feel so dumb.
I don't know. Not Tilda Swinton.
I think it is Tilda, isn't it?
Is it really Tilda Swinton?
I think it is.
Oh, yeah. I was most interested, in the Deep's love triangle with an octopus. And like the only thing that has me like, I should watch season 5 is what happened to Ashley. That's the only reason I'm invested in season 5 at the moment. But yeah.
Anyway.
That all just went over my head. I am not Drax, as my reflexes were not fast enough to catch it. I'm going to take us so far in another direction here.
Uh-oh.
I watched this a little over a week ago, but it knocked me out so much that I'm going to try to talk about it.
Wow.
Please bear with me. I watched Spike Lee's Bamboozled, which has one
You
of
were
the
bamboozled.
more daring synopses of like anything I've ever watched. It centers around an African-American TV producer, Pierre Delacroix, and he is sort of exhausted with the function of this TV studio that he works at because the network rejects his ideas. So in an effort to get himself fired, he pitches a minstrel show where black actors wear blackface and recall all of these offensive stereotypes used decades ago. And it happens, and it's a huge hit. And I found it to be an absolutely brilliant movie. I gave it a 5, and it was one of those 5s where sort of like La La Land and like the Todd Haynes film Carol, as the ending was happening and as I was watching it, I was like, do I love this or hate this? Is this going too far? I don't know. I'm deciding this is brilliant because only like 3 films have made me think this way. The main character Pierre is very interesting. Damon Wayans plays him with sort of eclectic, hard to pin down accent that sort of, to me, suggests that Pierre is uncomfortable with his own heritage, and that's, I think, invoked by him and other characters. Jada Pinkett Smith is amazing in this. She plays his assistant, and there's some really powerful consideration of how women are treated in the entertainment industry, which I think it's kind of good on Spike for investigating this, because this is kind of pushed to the side in movies like his first one, She's Gotta Have It. While it's mature, it's maybe not like perfect in the way it explores womanhood, and I remember him being critical of Spielberg's The Color Purple for how it depicted Black men. So I value that he's gone out of his way to portray Black women in this way. It borrows a lot visually and textually from All That Jazz and Network. The actors that, some of the most powerful scenes in this are seeing the actors literally like put on the blackface before they go out and record the show in front of a studio audience. And one or both of them do the "It's Showtime" thing that is in All That Jazz. And it's got a similar, but I think an even more just like rocks you every time it happens. And there's an evocation of that famous phrase in Network. And in many ways, it's a riff on so many other things, but I think it's a rare example of something that genuinely eclipses those things. And it ends in this, it's a very like angry, righteously angry movie, but I don't think it's any less intelligent, clever, or thoughtful for that, which I think is such a hard line to walk. I came away from this with so much respect for the performers and for Spike, because even though it's portraying these theoretically funny things, and they show audience members that are Black and white, and many of the Black audience members find it funny. And so there's this portrayal of natural human responses to it, but ultimately it's impossible to come away from the movie without feeling like some shadow of immense like pain and injustice. I was totally knocked out by this. Michael Rappaport plays the Pierre Delacroix's boss, and is like the perfect like. He's just such a scum in this, and it's so good. This was a 5 for me. I was knocked out. A lot of it's shot on camcorder, which gives it this interesting feel, and then the actual TV show in the movie is shot in a much higher quality, which the transition between those two things is interesting. I'd really be interested to see what you two thought of this, if you were to see it. So maybe in a future season or for a movie night, something to think about.
Yeah. It's been on my list for a really long time. I think the most striking thing that I know about it, I think, is the way that Rappaport is credited on the poster with all the other actors. using a word I'm not going to say on the podcast. But I do think it's definitely deliberate that he's referred to in that way on the poster. And there's definitely some of that anger you were talking about that makes me interested to check it out. I've seen a few Spike Lees, but not as many as I probably should have.
Let me see this freaking poster. What are you talking about?
Oh, jeez.
He's another, like, we talked about this a few episodes ago, but there are a lot of huge directors that we just haven't talked about yet. And it's kind of funny to see how those slip through the cracks.
Yeah.
This is a very interesting poster.
Yes.
All right. That's all I can say.
Yeah. Well, Mitchell said in our group chat that maybe it's not a good time it's not smart to run down today for obvious reasons. But I think we're going to do it anyway for Australia.
Breaking barefoot across the outback.
Yes, he is.
It's always fresh in the outback.
Oh, they got to bring back the unlimited shrimp. Mitchell, are you ready to start us off?
I'm ready to punch the Prime Minister.
Okay. In 3, 2, 1, go.
Running away from 80 cents.
3 out of 5.
Running barefoot.
2 out of 5.
Riding bareback.
2 out of 5.
The Melbourne Horse Cadets.
4 out of 5.
It being a long way to Tipperary.
4 out of 5.
That Final Shot.
4 out of 5.
Mel Gibson hating the British.
3 out of 5.
Steel Springs.
4 out of 5.
Archie teaching history.
2 out of 5.
Brian May's contribution to the score.
3 out of 5.
Starting a bike shop.
3 out of 5.
Not ordering your men to do anything you wouldn't do yourself.
4 out of 5.
A great pile of rock.
3 out of 5.
Beta British moment.
2 out of 5.
Sigma Aussie moment.
3 out of 5.
Why is the donkey laughing?
4 out of 5.
As fast as a leopard.
4 out of 5.
Luger haggling.
4 out of 5.
We're dead, mate. Piss off.
3 out of 5.
Knowing more about him than his mom.
3 out of 5.
1 second.
Calming opera.
4 out of 5.
Time.
We'll count that little split second.
Yeah. You snuck it in.
And
I'll allow it.
and addition.
All right.
Congrats, Zach. You made it across the line.
Oh my goodness.
You won. You won Gallipoli for Winston Churchill. So he doesn't drop out of political office and join the Royal Scots Fusiliers in the Western Front before becoming Prime Minister.
Alas.
Well, Mitchell, I think you're next up, right? What is our next film
crap.
gonna be?
You ever hate when those farm animals keep making noises and you just wanna shut them up, and then they are shut up. There's no more bah. It's over because the lambs have been silenced because we're doing Silence of the Lambs. Woo! Let's go! Anthony Hopkins again. Woo! Christian has not seen this.
This is true.
He's gonna be very excited. Very excited. The OG, the real, well, not the OG, but the real Hannibal Lecter to a lot of people.
Yeah. Have you seen any of the Hannibal films, Christian?
Not to my knowledge. No.
This is a good one to start with.
Yeah.
Like most people did.
Yeah.
We're gonna have a good time.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah. Another genre pivot for us. I love it. All right.
Yeah. I gotta get back to World War II. It's been too long. It's been like a couple episodes. It's too long.
It's not been long at all.